At 8:42 a.m. Beijing Standard Time this morning, a reconnaissance satellite operated by the People's Liberation Army detected an object entering the northern approaches to the South China Sea that triggered immediate alerts across multiple command centers in mainland China. What Chinese military planners observed on their screens was not a single vessel. It was an entire carrier strike group centered around the USS Theodore Roosevelt, a nuclear-powered supercarrier displacing 100,000 tons and carrying 75 combat aircraft, accompanied by 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, 1 Ticonderoga-class cruiser equipped with Aegis ballistic missile defense systems, and a nuclear attack submarine running submerged at unknown depth. The Theodore Roosevelt had spent the previous 16 days conducting exercises near Guam, approximately 2,400 nautical miles to the east, and its sudden westward movement toward waters that Beijing claims as territorial seas represents the most significant American naval deployment into this theater in 11 months. What happened next reveals something that changes the entire strategic calculation in the Indo-Pacific region. Subscribe to Dr. Elena Harris right now and hit that notification bell, because what the United States Navy just initiated is unprecedented, and you need to understand exactly what it means for the balance of power in the most contested waters on Earth. The South China Sea represents the most strategically valuable maritime corridor in the global economic system. Approximately $37 trillion in trade transits through these waters annually, representing roughly 21% of global maritime commerce. The sea lane connects manufacturing centers in China, South Korea, and Japan to consumer markets in Europe and the eastern United States, forming the arterial system through which the world economy operates. Energy flows comprise a critical component of this trade volume. Chinese oil imports totaling 85 million barrels per day pass through the South China Sea, representing approximately 72% of the nation's total petroleum consumption. Liquefied natural gas shipments from Qatar and Australia to Northeast Asian markets, valued at approximately $87 billion annually, follow routes directly through waters where the Theodore Roosevelt Carrier Strike Group is now operating. Beyond economic significance, the South China Sea functions as the primary operating area for Chinese naval forces, attempting to break through what Beijing describes as the first island chain. This geographic concept, developed by American strategists during the Cold War and now adopted by Chinese military planners, defines a line running from the Japanese archipelago through Taiwan and the Philippines to the coast of Borneo. Every Chinese naval vessel seeking access to the Western Pacific Ocean must transit through choke points along this chain, creating strategic vulnerabilities that Beijing has spent the past 2 decades attempting to overcome through construction of artificial islands, deployment of advanced anti-ship missile systems, and expansion of submarine forces. China maintains territorial claims over approximately 90% of the South China Sea based on what it calls the 9-line, a boundary marked on Chinese maps since 1947 but rejected by international tribunals, neighboring nations, and the United States Navy. These claims encompass the Paracel Islands, the Spratly Islands, Scarborough Shoal, and vast expanses of open water that international law designates as either exclusive economic zones belonging to other nations or international waters open to navigation by vessels of all countries. The distance from mainland China to some of the features Beijing claims as sovereign territory exceeds 1,200 kilometers, extending Chinese assertions far beyond any conventional definition of territorial waters. The artificial island construction program represents Beijing's attempt to transform legal claims into physical facts. Between 2013 and 2016, Chinese dredging vessels operating in the Spratly Islands pumped approximately 13 square kilometers of sand and rock onto 7 partially submerged reefs, creating installations large enough to accommodate 3,000-meter runways capable of handling fighter aircraft, hardened shelters for surface-to-air missile systems, radar facilities providing surveillance coverage extending 560 kilometers in all directions, and harbor facilities designed to service both Coast Guard cutters and People's Liberation Army Navy warships. The largest installation, built on Fiery Cross Reef, occupies 74 square kilometers and hosts permanent military infrastructure that analysts assess as being designed specifically to contest American freedom of navigation operations. The Theodore Roosevelt's movement into these waters occurs against the backdrop of escalating tensions that began accelerating 3 weeks ago when Philippine maritime authorities attempted to resupply a garrison stationed on 2nd Thomas Shoal, a partially submerged reef located 195 kilometers from the Philippine coast and claimed by both Manila and Beijing. Chinese Coast Guard vessels, some displacing over 10,000 tons and equipped with water cannons capable of generating pressure exceeding 160 pounds per square inch, intercepted the Philippine supply mission, damaged the vessel attempting to reach the garrison, and forced it to retreat without completing its mission. The confrontation, captured on video by Philippine personnel and subsequently broadcast globally, showed Chinese crews deliberately ramming smaller Philippine boats and using water cannons against sailors attempting to deliver food and medical supplies to troops who have been stationed on the rusting hull of a World War II-era landing ship that the Philippines deliberately grounded on the reef in 1999 to assert territorial claims. The incident triggered immediate diplomatic protests from Manila, which maintains a mutual defense treaty with the United States dating to 1951. That treaty contains explicit language committing American forces to defend Philippine territory against armed attack, creating a potential scenario where confrontation between Philippine and Chinese vessels could legally obligate direct United States military intervention. American officials, speaking through both the State Department and the Pentagon, issued statements reaffirming treaty commitments and declaring that attacks on Philippine vessels operating in their exclusive economic zone would be met with appropriate responses. The language was carefully calibrated to avoid automatic triggers, while signaling that Washington's patience with Beijing's increasingly aggressive enforcement of maritime claims has reached a threshold requiring demonstration rather than mere diplomatic protest. Here is where the Theodore Roosevelt deployment becomes critical to understanding what is actually happening beneath the surface of public statements and diplomatic messaging. The carrier strike group did not simply sail into the South China Sea along standard transit routes used for routine freedom of navigation operations. Instead, the Roosevelt entered through the Bashi Channel, the waterway separating Taiwan from the Philippines, at a time when Chinese military forces were conducting live-fire exercises approximately 180 kilometers to the north, as part of what Beijing described as routine training, but outside observers assessed as pressure tactics designed to intimidate Taiwan's newly elected government. The American carrier passed within the exercise area's extended surveillance zone, forcing Chinese forces to track its movement and divert attention from the Taiwan-focused operations they had been conducting for the previous 9 days. This routing choice was deliberate. The United States Navy operates globally using a doctrine of presence, the concept that American vessels maintain the right under international law to transit any waters not specifically recognized as territorial seas, regardless of which nation claims those waters or objects to such transit. Freedom of navigation operations represent the operational expression of this doctrine, with American warships periodically sailing within 12 nautical miles of disputed features to demonstrate that the United States does not recognize excessive maritime claims and will not allow those claims to restrict international navigation rights. The Theodore Roosevelt's transit represents a significantly escalated version of this concept. Rather than a single destroyer conducting a brief passage near a disputed feature, the deployment involves an entire carrier strike group establishing an operating pattern in waters Beijing considers part of its territory, signaling that American naval presence in the region is not limited to symbolic gestures, but includes the capacity to sustain combat operations if circumstances require. What makes this particular deployment extraordinary is not simply the presence of American naval power in contested waters. The United States Navy has conducted similar operations previously, including carrier transits through the Taiwan Strait, destroyer passages near Chinese artificial islands, and submarine operations in areas where Chinese forces attempt to restrict foreign military activities. What distinguishes the current operation is its timing, its duration, and the specific capabilities the Roosevelt Carrier Strike Group brings to this particular theater at this particular moment. The Theodore Roosevelt carries an air wing designated Carrier Air Wing 11, comprising 48 F-A-18 Super Hornet strike fighters, 5 EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft designed specifically to jam radar systems and communications networks, 4 E-2D Advanced Hawkeye airborne early warning planes providing surveillance coverage extending over 550 kilometers from the carrier, a squadron of MH-60 helicopters configured for both anti-submarine warfare and search and rescue operations, and 4 C-2 Greyhound logistics aircraft. The Super Hornets aboard the Roosevelt are equipped with AGM-158C long-range anti-ship missiles, weapons with a range exceeding 370 kilometers that use advanced targeting systems to locate and attack surface vessels while remaining beyond the effective range of most shipboard air defense systems. The electronic warfare Growlers carry ALQ-99 jamming pods capable of disrupting the radar and communication systems Chinese forces rely on to coordinate defensive operations across their artificial island network. The escort vessels accompanying the Roosevelt enhance these capabilities with their own weapon systems and sensors. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, each displacing approximately 9,000 tons and carrying crews of 329, are armed with Tomahawk cruise missiles capable of striking targets over 1,600 kilometers away, standard interceptor missiles designed to destroy incoming threats including anti-ship missiles and aircraft, torpedoes for underwater combat, and 5-inch naval guns providing surface fire support. The Ticonderoga-class cruiser brings Aegis ballistic missile defense capability, allowing the strike group to track and potentially intercept ballistic missiles launched from mainland China or any of the military installations Beijing has constructed on artificial islands throughout the theater. The submarine component of the strike group, the identity of which the Navy has not officially disclosed, but which analysts assess as likely being USS Mississippi, a Virginia-class nuclear attack submarine, provides capabilities that surface vessels cannot match. Virginia-class submarines carry Tomahawk cruise missiles, advanced torpedoes, and sophisticated electronic intelligence collection equipment, and they operate while submerged at depths and in locations that make detection by adversary forces extremely difficult. The submarine's presence means that even if Chinese forces can track the Roosevelt and its surface escorts using satellite imagery, radar systems, and ocean surveillance networks, they cannot have confidence about the location or activities of American underwater assets operating in the same general area. This uncertainty complicates Chinese defensive planning and creates vulnerability that Beijing's military commanders must account for in any scenario involving potential confrontation. The timing of this deployment connects directly to developments occurring simultaneously in multiple theaters across the Indo-Pacific region. While the Roosevelt operates in the South China Sea, the USS Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group is conducting exercises near the Korean Peninsula following North Korea's test launch of a new solid-fuel intercontinental ballistic missile that flew over 1,100 kilometers before impacting in the Sea of Japan. The USS Carl Vinson is operating east of Taiwan following transits through the Philippine Sea that brought American naval aviation assets within 240 kilometers of the Taiwan Strait. The simultaneous presence of 3 carrier strike groups in the Western Pacific represents the highest concentration of American naval power in this region, since tensions over Taiwan escalated to crisis levels 18 months ago, following high-profile visits by American congressional delegations to Taipei. This concentration of forces creates operational flexibility that single carrier deployments cannot achieve. With 3 strike groups operating in relatively close proximity, measured by naval standards, meaning within approximately 1,500 kilometers of each other, the United States Navy can surge additional forces to any flashpoint within 24 to 48 hours, respond to multiple simultaneous crises without leaving any area uncovered, and demonstrate to adversaries that American naval capacity in this theater exceeds what any single deployment might suggest. The message to Beijing is clear and unmistakable. American military presence in waters China claims as its own is not limited by the capabilities of individual vessels or strike groups, but represents a fraction of the total combat power the United States can project into this region if strategic circumstances require escalation. But here is where it gets truly extraordinary. The Theodore Roosevelt is not simply transiting through the South China Sea on a route designed to arrive at some other destination. Instead, the strike group has established a patrol pattern in waters approximately 180 kilometers southwest of Scarborough Shoal, the disputed feature that became the focal point of a major confrontation between Chinese and Philippine vessels in 2012, and which Beijing has since effectively controlled through sustained Coast Guard presence, despite the feature being located 220 kilometers from the Philippine coast and over 1,000 kilometers from mainland China. The patrol pattern, observable through analysis of ship tracking data and satellite imagery published by commercial firms monitoring naval movements, indicates the Roosevelt is not passing through, but is rather operating in a defined area for an extended period. The duration of this operation remains classified, but statements from Pacific Fleet commanders suggest the deployment could continue for an indefinite period, depending on regional security developments. This operational posture represents a significant departure from previous freedom of navigation operations. Those missions typically involved single vessels or small surface action groups conducting brief transits near disputed features, with the operation lasting no more than a few hours before the American vessels departed the area and continued along planned routes to other destinations. The Theodore Roosevelt deployment instead establishes persistent American naval presence in waters that Beijing considers sensitive, creating a condition where Chinese forces must continuously monitor, track, and plan responses to American military activities occurring in an area where the People's Liberation Army Navy previously operated with minimal interference from foreign forces. The economic dimensions of this deployment deserve careful analysis because they reveal strategic calculations that extend beyond immediate military confrontation scenarios. China's economy depends fundamentally on maritime trade flowing through the South China Sea. Disruption to shipping lanes in this region, whether through military action, blockade operations, or even the threat of such operations creating insurance rate increases that make commercial shipping economically unviable, would inflict catastrophic damage on Chinese economic interests. Estimates from the Peterson Institute for International Economics suggest that a sustained closure of South China Sea shipping lanes would reduce Chinese GDP by approximately 7% in the first year, translating to economic losses exceeding $630 billion. Energy imports would face immediate disruption, forcing China to seek alternative supply routes that would take months or years to establish and would cost substantially more due to longer transit distances and the need to develop new port infrastructure. Manufacturing supply chains would experience cascading failures as components sourced from Southeast Asian nations and raw materials imported from Australia and the Middle East could no longer reach Chinese factories along efficient routes. Export-dependent industries, which generate approximately 37% of China's total economic output, would lose access to shipping lanes that connect production centers in Guangdong, Fujian, and Shanghai to consumer markets in Europe and North America. The economic impact would not be limited to lost trade, but would include second-order effects, including unemployment in export industries, financial system stress from unpaid loans to companies dependent on maritime trade, and potential social instability from economic dislocation affecting hundreds of millions of workers. The Theodore Roosevelt's presence in the South China Sea functions as a physical demonstration that the United States Navy possesses the capability to interdict Chinese maritime trade if strategic circumstances evolved to the point where such action became necessary. This capability creates deterrent pressure that operates independently of whether American forces ever actually implement blockade operations. The mere knowledge that such operations are possible, that American naval forces can position themselves astride China's most critical trade routes and potentially enforce restrictions on commercial shipping, influences Chinese strategic calculations about the risks associated with military aggression against Taiwan, against Philippine forces operating in disputed waters, or against American vessels and aircraft conducting operations that Beijing objects to but cannot prevent. Chinese responses to the Theodore Roosevelt deployment have been carefully calibrated to demonstrate displeasure without escalating to direct confrontation. The People's Liberation Army Eastern Theater Command, the organization responsible for military operations in the Taiwan Strait and the northern South China Sea, issued a statement describing the American carrier's presence as provocative, destabilizing, and a threat to regional peace and security. Chinese Coast Guard vessels have increased patrols near areas where the Roosevelt is operating, creating situations where American and Chinese government ships operate in close proximity, raising the risk of miscalculation or accidents that could trigger wider incidents. Chinese military aircraft have increased flights in the South China Sea, with Pentagon officials reporting that J-11 and J-16 fighters operating from airbases on Hainan Island have conducted sorties that brought them within visual range of American reconnaissance aircraft operating in international airspace above the disputed waters. These responses follow established patterns that Chinese forces have employed in previous confrontations with American military operations in contested areas. The pattern involves vocal diplomatic protests, increased military activities designed to shadow and monitor American forces, and careful avoidance of actions that would clearly constitute attacks or uses of force that might trigger American military responses under rules of engagement or international law. Chinese commanders understand that direct confrontation with a carrier strike group would likely result in significant losses for People's Liberation Army forces, given the concentration of American combat power, sophisticated weapon systems, and training advantages that United States Navy personnel maintain. Beijing's strategy instead focuses on gradually increasing the costs and risks associated with American freedom of navigation operations through sustained presence operations, incremental expansion of artificial island infrastructure, and diplomatic pressure designed to fragment international consensus about the illegality of China's maritime claims. But the Chinese response also reveals important information about Beijing's current strategic position and the constraints under which Chinese military and political leadership operate. China's leadership, under Xi Jinping, who has consolidated political power to a degree not seen since Mao Zedong, and who has staked significant political capital on assertions of Chinese strength and inevitable rise to great power status, faces a fundamental dilemma. Backing down from confrontations with the United States Navy damages the narrative of Chinese strength and determination that Xi has built his political legitimacy around. Yet, escalating confrontations with American carrier strike groups risks military defeats that would be even more damaging to that narrative and could trigger domestic political consequences that threaten the Chinese Communist Party's grip on power. The economic pressures China currently faces compound this strategic dilemma. The Chinese economy is experiencing the slowest growth rates in over 4 decades, with official statistics reporting GDP expansion of 4.7% in the most recent quarter, but independent analysts suggesting actual growth may be substantially lower once accounting adjustments and data reliability issues are considered. Youth unemployment, calculated using methodologies that differ from official Chinese statistics, exceeds 21% according to research from institutions including the Rhodium Group and the Peterson Institute. The property sector, which generates approximately 25% of economic activity when including construction, materials supply, and related services, is experiencing what Chinese officials describe as adjustments, but what outside observers assess as potential systemic crisis, with major developers, including Evergrande and Country Garden, defaulting on dollar-denominated bonds totaling over $340 billion. These economic stresses create domestic political pressures that limit Xi Jinping's freedom of action in foreign policy confrontations. Military operations that disrupt trade, trigger international sanctions, or lead to reduced foreign investment would accelerate economic problems that are already generating public discontent, visible through increased protests, online criticism despite censorship, and capital flight that continues despite government restrictions. The Chinese leadership must therefore balance the need to demonstrate strength and resolve in territorial disputes with the imperative to avoid economic disruptions that could trigger domestic instability. This balance explains why Chinese responses to the Theodore Roosevelt deployment have been vocal and visible, but have stopped short of actions that would clearly constitute military confrontation requiring American counter-responses. What happens next depends on decisions being made right now in Washington, Beijing, Manila, and other capitals throughout the Indo-Pacific region. The Theodore Roosevelt deployment creates a new baseline for American naval presence in the South China Sea, signaling that freedom of navigation operations are no longer limited to brief symbolic gestures, but can include sustained operating presence by major combat units. If China accepts this presence without further escalation, it establishes a precedent that American carrier strike groups can operate in disputed waters without triggering Chinese military responses beyond shadowing and diplomatic protests. This precedent would represent a strategic setback for Beijing's long-term objective of establishing effective control over the South China Sea through gradual expansion of military presence and incremental assertion of sovereignty claims. Alternatively, Chinese forces could escalate their response in ways designed to raise the costs and risks of American operations without crossing thresholds that would clearly justify military retaliation. Potential escalation options include more aggressive aircraft intercepts, where Chinese fighters conduct dangerous maneuvers near American reconnaissance planes, increased cyber attacks against American military communications networks operating in the region, deployment of additional anti-ship missile systems to artificial islands that would expand the threat envelope American forces must account for, or increased Coast Guard activities near Philippine-controlled features designed to create multiple simultaneous crisis points that force American decision-makers to choose which confrontations to prioritize. The most dangerous scenario involves miscalculation or accidents that escalate beyond the intentions of either side. Modern naval operations involve complex interactions between aircraft, surface vessels, and submarines operating in close proximity under rules of engagement that authorize defensive actions if forces perceive imminent threats. A Chinese fighter conducting an aggressive intercept maneuver could collide with an American reconnaissance aircraft, creating a repeat of the 2001 EP-3 incident, but in far more tense strategic circumstances. A Chinese submarine trailing the Theodore Roosevelt strike group could be detected by American anti-submarine forces and could react in ways that American commanders interpret as preparation for attack, triggering defensive responses that escalate into actual combat. A Chinese Coast Guard vessel could miscalculate during close proximity maneuvers with American warships, leading to collision that both sides interpret as deliberate ramming requiring retaliation. These scenarios are not theoretical speculation, but represent real risks that naval officers from both nations train to prevent and manage. The history of great power confrontations includes numerous examples where unintended escalation transformed limited tactical situations into strategic crises. The Cuban Missile Crisis nearly resulted in nuclear war, partially because of communication failures and misunderstood signals between American and Soviet forces. The 1914 sequence of mobilizations and ultimatums that triggered World War I occurred despite most political leaders not wanting general European war. The danger in the current situation is that both American and Chinese forces are operating under political pressure to demonstrate strength and resolve, creating conditions where neither side wants to appear to back down from confrontations, even when both sides would prefer to avoid actual combat.